Hello EPQ students, welcome to this screencast which I've entitled Artefact Audit, Planning a Successful EPQ. Now an audit is when accountants come into your company and they check the books really carefully. So I'm using this as a metaphor, the audit metaphor, to say that when you get planning on the EPQ, you need to take a deep dive into all the intricate details that you need to think about in order for this EPQ to be successful. So today, I want to review some of the features that make a successful artifact. I want to provide a detailed overview of planning an artifact, and I particularly want to stress the fact that this video would be useful if you're doing the planning review stage of the production log, doing a really deep dive into all of the project planning that you need to do at this stage. So there'll be a very strong focus on AO1, project planning, but also on AO4, which is achieving planned outcomes, getting to the conclusion and checking that the artifact is fit for purpose. Planning is absolutely essential. I say this to my students over and over again, particularly with the artifact project. My preference as an EPQ coordinator is almost always for artifacts. However, they're much more likely to go wrong, and that is because they require more intricate planning than the research question, in my opinion. So, in order to think about your artifact, you need to think about a research phase before you get to purpose clarity. What do I mean by that? Well, students usually start with their research base. So they might know that they want to write about a particular element of psychology. And you've got to do the reading and the research before you get the exact purpose that you need for your artifact. Getting clarity of purpose is absolutely essential in the artifact. So that needs to be grounded in very detailed research. You need to plan your construction phase very carefully. And AQA, the exam board that we use, strongly recommend a pilot or a form of testing. Now you need to do this before the mid-project review, because as many of you know, when you complete the mid-project review, you finalize the task, you finalize the research question or the artifact. So before you begin the construction and experimental phase, you need to make absolutely sure that you have the right artifact project, and that means some form of testing or pilot. Once you've done the construction and experimentation phase, and this will be a long phase, and by experimentation, what I mean is you might want to try different designs, you might be using different materials, you might even change your audience slightly during this particular time. When you have completed this phase, in terms of the production log, that means the project product review, you will get feedback from your supervisor and from your consulting specialist or technical mentor if you've managed to engage someone with expertise. Next, I've said you need a kind of tinkering phase. That's where you improve the artifact. You might use that feedback very carefully and see if you can make some additions or modifications to the actual artifact itself. And then, of course, you need to very, very carefully plan an evaluation phase. This is when you decide whether the artifact is fit for purpose or not. So you'll have a very definite audience, you'll have a very definite purpose with very clear success criteria. You will give these to the people who are going to give you their feedback, and then you will complete a rigorous evaluation. And finally, you need to think about how you will analyze that feedback. How will you present that within your presentation, within Project Q, and within your, most of all, within your artifact report? Will you be using data charts like pie charts or bar graphs? Or how will you show what was the feedback and whether you can make a good judgment, was your artifact fit for purpose or not? Now, you need an excellent research base. I've covered this in a video previously, but I make no apology for repeating myself. It has to be highly developed. It has to be the same detail that we would expect of a 5,000-word report on a research question. So this might take the form of literature, looking at journal articles and expert writing. If you're doing something that is newsworthy, you're going to need to look at magazines, at newspapers, etc., television programs, as I say here, discussion forums. Primary research is very important in most artifacts. So you might want to conduct interviews, use questionnaires or surveys. When you do this, you need to make sure that they are very, very well designed and that you have thought about ethics and you've thought about health and safety issues. Now, podcasts are an amazing research source for nearly everything these days. I would strongly recommend looking very closely at these. Of course, many of my students also go on to do online courses, especially Coursera and FutureLearn. YouTube can have fantastic resources too. And of course, part of your research base might be experimentation. So first-hand experimentation, where you might be changing the shape of your rocket, or you might be redesigning your code and looking at different versions of it. So it's very important, therefore, that you have a highly detailed research base, and this research base must translate into constructing the artifact. It must be part of the project, not something that goes alongside it. Now, purpose. I want to focus on this, really important. Clarity of purpose. Well, just like a research question, I think it's very good to have one main purpose, one main thing that you want your artifact to do, but think, can you break it down into several subordinate purposes? This can be very useful for developing your success criteria, because really good success criteria usually comes in the form of something like a Likert scale that I'm going to show you in a minute, or something which is really measurable, which means that when you actually decide whether the artifact is fit for purpose, you have some clear criteria, that it's not just a yes-no answer, that you get nuance. Now, going on to the idea of materials, it's very important when you do your artifact audit that you think about all of the physical things. Now, of course, not all artifacts are a material outcome. Some might be a CAD drawing, others might be a speech or, a play or a dance. But if you are making something, especially if it's a technical artifact, this is a chess robot arm that was made by one of my students. It can actually pick up the chess pieces, and of course there's all the complication of the coding to instruct the robot arm where to move the chess pieces. Now, I use this as an example because this student actually had great difficulty during COVID sourcing these screws, and he had to wait for them to come from China. In the end, he had to abandon these screws, buy ones in the UAE where we live, and he had to repurpose each screw. And he told me that took him about 30 hours. So it's very important as part of your audit that you think about all the materials. Where can you source them? How much will they cost? I've had a student whose project went wrong because he didn't realize that the materials that he needed would cost £5,000. And obviously that was far too much money. Will you experiment with different materials? This is very important because one of the things that I like in artifact reports is to see critical evaluation, where a student looks at the virtues and the problems with different materials and constructs tables evidencing this process of critical evaluation. I think it's very important that you could consult with experts if you have something which is very complicated. It's no good going to your poor old teachers who've already overworked and asking them how to construct a robot arm. You're going to need to find people in robotics to do that. And of course, please think very carefully about health and safety. I had a student before who constructed a lawnmower engine that worked on hydrogen, and the project was incredibly complex because hydrogen is a highly controlled substance, and that made the project really difficult. So think carefully about health and safety. Now, pre-built versus self-made. Many students feel that if they're going to do something like make a go-kart, that they have to do it from scratch. Well, that would literally take thousands of hours and incredibly complex tools, etc. In fact, no person usually makes anything from scratch. So think carefully about what is pre-made, because you do not have to make everything. You can repurpose things. And you can recreate things. You don't have to do everything from scratch. I had a student who did a brilliant project where he produced code to detect a COVID-19 cough, so that this software could be an alternative to the nasal test that we all went through during COVID. Now, the reason why this project was so successful is he found an enormous database of coughs. He did not have to construct that himself. I've had other students who've used drone kits and then adapted them. One particular student who used a drone kit to produce his own drone that could film mountains in order to pre-program climbing routes that would be useful. Now, this is still a fantastic, creative, interesting project, but he didn't need to fabricate every piece of the drone himself. This means that you could save time and money in many cases. So think very closely about what you have to make or repurpose and what is available there for you. As long as there's a strong element of research, as long as there is a creative element, you do not have to manufacture each and every component yourself. Now, expertise is absolutely crucial. Many of us begin with great, amazing plans of the things that we would like to do, and then we discover that they are so complicated and so difficult, and I'm going to show you a project in a moment that is like this, that really you don't have the knowledge, and you do not have access to the particular experts, and maybe it is very hard to source the specialists. So I would say at an early stage, make sure that you have access to the knowledge and the expertise in your area or online. But if you get deep into the project and then you realize that there are elements of it that you're not going to be able to solve, then that project will be unsuccessful. So in terms of your audit, what are the skills you're going to need? Can you find these specialists and experts? What are the construction skills you're going to need? If you're making circuit boards and electronics, how long is it going to take you to do the soldering? What's the complexity of it? If you're coding, how difficult is this code? Remember that when people write software, they write it over years and teams. So do not set yourself projects that are unrealistic and that you are not going to be capable of finishing. I'm going to say more about time in a minute. So I will just conclude by saying, think very carefully then about tools, about software, about expertise. Now, time. This is so important. The EPQ specifies that it should take about 120 hours. Many of my students spend more like 300 or 400 hours on the EPQ, especially with artifact projects. So it's very important that you carefully break down all the stages of the artifact construction, especially at the point of the planning review. This is the time when you have to be realistic about the project before you fill in the mid-project review. So I would suggest you be very flexible, but your estimates need to be carefully considered. They need to be based on grounded evidence of how long things are going to take. And I think you should divide it into a best case and worst case scenario. I encourage my artifact students to have 2 different Gantt charts or calendars where they think exceptionally carefully about how this might work. So if you're doing something like CAD, for instance, it is incredibly time consuming. So when you do your kind of guesstimates of how long things are going to take, please make sure that you've experimented with the CAD software or whatever techniques it is you're going to use before you make these estimations. That's why I suggest you go into what I call micro detail. Really think about the small things. That's what good project planning's about, so that you don't get some terrible shock in the middle of the project when you realize that you've taken on far too much. And remember to work the EPQ into your life schedule. Many of my students are doing 4 A-levels. Some of them play for national sports teams, or they have huge musical or drama commitments, etc. All of your good and successful EPQ planning, both for research questions and for artifacts, will fit into the general pattern of your life. So that is an important element of your planning too. Now, I've included this picture of a motorbike because this was a brilliant project of a student of mine who sourced an old Ducati motorbike, and he completely repurposed it and restored it in every conceivable way. And at the end of it, he was able to sell it. You can see what a beautiful job he did. But he actually told me in the end that this took him more like 700 or 800 hours rather than the 120 hours. So I want you to think very, very carefully about your artifact, because if you are taking on a job like this, we've got wiring, he had to use specialized tools, he had to go to motorcycle companies and repurpose parts of the motorbike that didn't exist. He was fortunate enough to get access to a very sophisticated garage, but this was an enormous project. And it's the kind of project that should be avoided for nearly everybody, I feel. Now, what is the pilot and why do we need it? Well, the AQA exam board that we use strongly recommends a pilot. And this is some kind of truncated, shortened version of the artifact. So if you're doing a story, it might be a page of the story, okay? You must test your design thoroughly before you complete the mid-project review. So build this into your planning, because at this point, many students will tinker with the artifact purpose and artifact outcome. Just like students who are doing a research question might actually introduce new limiting factors, narrowing the focus of their research question. So at this point, when you have some kind of pilot or testing phase, you may want to tinker with those important elements of the artifact project. So please build that into your planning very carefully. Now, it's very important that throughout the artifact process, you are evidencing it. This goes well beyond things like Gantt charts or using Notion or, Tom's Plan or Monday.com, whatever it is that you're using. My students use various pieces of software. I want you to think about the stages of construction and the way in which the planning is evidenced to the examiner, because this is very important for AO3 decision-making, problem-solving, and creative and critical thinking. So I've included this picture here because my student did a beautiful piece of art where she was highly critical of cosmetic surgery, but she produced an extraordinary scrapbook that showed the incredible, intricate levels of her planning all the way through. Don't forget the EPQ is a process-based qualification, not just an outcome-based. So it's different from a piece of coursework. Here we want to see the stages of planning, the thinking, etc. So this is very important. So sketches, if you're doing film storyboarding, location planning, if you're making a dress like some of my students do, we want sketches, early designs, material selection. If you're using CAD, we would like to see all the different sections of the CAD. So think closely how you're going to evidence this for the examiner. What will go into the production log? Which elements, which screen grabs will you use for the EPQ artifact report? What will go into the presentation? Do not replicate the content between those three media. Make sure that each time they are unique and show the whole coverage of the project and show all of your skills development and your decision making for AO3. Now, the evaluation is an incredibly important stage, and I said earlier that the key to successful evaluation is firstly a very, very clear purpose, very clear audience, and then you need concrete and specific success criteria. I said before, I think it's a good idea to have a number of success criteria rather than simply one, because that gives you nuance. Now, I like students to use something like a Likert scale, because it gives you nuance then. It's not simply a yes-no answer. And this then provides evidence of rigorous evaluation. And it produces really good and rich data, which you can sift through and decide how you are going to present. You might want to think very closely about how the evaluation is going to work while you plan it. Are you going to use focus groups? Are you going to get questionnaires? Are you going to use QR codes? Are you going to get qualitative feedback so that you interview people and you decide how you're going to present that? If you are going to interview people, how will you transcribe these interviews, etc.? So this is all very important, so that at the end you can visualize how the feedback's going to work and how you are going to evidence to the examiner that you have evaluated this feedback and decided that crucial question: is your artifact fit for purpose? Did it achieve what you set out to do? So, in conclusion, we come to the end. I hope that this was a very valuable video for you. I want to reiterate that artifact planning is very complex. So when you come to this planning review stage, you need to have multiple layers of planning that encompass the entire completion of the project right till the moment that you are going to hand it in and complete the production log and do your presentation, as well as the research and the construction and testing of the artifact. I have called this a complete audit of the artifact, so that you're thinking of everything from materials to cost to time to expertise to whether you have access to the tools, etc. We strongly encourage you to have a proper pilot or testing phase so that you know that the artifact is feasible, and only you, the student, not the supervisor, can tell you if the artifact is going to work. Of course, by all means, consult multiple people. That is absolutely crucial, but it will be your personal evaluation that this is the right artifact. Be flexible in your planning, but be as accurate as possible. Remember what I said about the micro details. Try to make sure that this is micro planning, not macro planning, because sometimes little parts of the project will shock you and they will put you completely off kilter. And finally, evidence the richness of your planning. Show the richness and complexity of the entire artifact EPQ journey. That is where you're going to get the marks, especially for AO3 critical evaluation, decision making, creative planning, etc. Now, I do hope that this was useful. As I said, I'm a great lover of artifacts, and I really hope that if you plan this carefully, that you will produce a beautiful artifact that will get you an A star in the EPQ. Best of luck.